When money starts to show up, it's not joy that comes first. It's fear, it's silence, it's that strange feeling that now there's something to lose. Before, when the balance was zero or negative, the problem was already out in the open. You knew exactly where you were. There wasn't much to defend. But when money starts coming in, even if it's not much, something changes inside. Your mind doesn't relax. It stays on alert. You start thinking twice before you say anything. You avoid mentioning it, avoid posting, avoid even showing signs that things are better, because deep down, you feel like if someone notices, something might go wrong. Have you felt that? Have you noticed how making money doesn't bring instant peace, but a different kind of tension? It's like the game changed without warning, and now any mistake costs more. You start policing yourself, not because anyone told you to, but because fear takes control. Fear of asking for help and looking weak. Fear of sharing a win and seeming like you're showing off. Fear someone will ask you for money. Fear someone will root against you. Fear you'll even mess it all up yourself. The money still isn't enough to fix your life, but it's already enough to create anxiety. And that's where the danger is. Because most people think financial stress only exists when money is missing. But almost nobody talks about the quiet stress of when it starts to appear. It's a strange territory with no map, where you're not completely broke anymore, but you're still far from feeling safe. In that moment, a lot of people make the same mistake without realizing it. They start acting like they're rich, or they start acting like they're about to lose everything. There's no middle ground. Either they relax too much, thinking now it's going to work out, or they get too tense, trying to control every cent in desperation. And both reactions come from the same place. Fear. Fear of going back to where they were. Fear of admitting they're not there yet. Fear of realizing this phase takes more mind than muscle. Because making money is one thing. Knowing what to do when it arrives is something completely different. Maybe you're living exactly this right now. Money started coming in a little more. Not enough to change everything, but enough to change how you sleep, how you think, how you react. You wake up already calculating. You spend the day imagining scenarios. At night, you replay old decisions and wonder if now it's really going to work out. And in the middle of all of it, you start going quiet. You get quieter, more reserved. Not out of arrogance, but for protection. Like silence is a way to hold this new reality in place without drawing attention, without tempting bad luck, without pushing your luck too hard. And nobody taught you how to deal with this, because nobody talks about this phase. Everyone talks about rock bottom and the mountaintop, but almost nobody talks about the middle. The moment you start climbing, but still slip. The moment you improve, but still don't trust it. The moment money turns into a daily psychological test. And it's exactly here that a lot of stories fall apart. Not from lack of income, but from too much tension. Not from one big mistake, but from small decisions made with built-up fear. Decisions that feel right in the short term, but come with an emotional cost that's way too high. You start avoiding risks, even necessary ones. You start saying no to opportunities because you're afraid to lose what little you've built. Or you say yes to things you shouldn't, just to prove to yourself you can now. You buy something you did need, not for usefulness, but to release pressure, to feel like all that effort is worth something. And then the guilt comes, because the money that came in wasn't really extra like that, because your security was still fragile, because the peace you expected didn't go me with it. It just came with another layer of worry. Silence in this phase feels like a survival strategy. You think that if nobody knows, nobody can interfere. That if you don't mention it, you won't attract problems. That if you act like nothing changed, maybe everything will keep working out. But that silence also isolates you. You start carrying everything alone. The doubts, the decisions, the fears. You don't share because you think nobody will understand. After all, complaining now feels ungrateful. Before, you complained because you didn't have it. Now, how can you complain when you do? And without realizing it, you slip into a constant state of alert, a mental exhaustion that doesn't show up in your body, but weighs on your mind every single day. And the strangest part is, the more you think you need to protect this money, the more fragile it feels. The more you try to control everything, the less control you feel like you have. Because the problem was never just the money itself. It was always what it represents. Safety, validation, relief, a chance to change your life. When it starts to show up, it activates all of that at once. And if you don't understand what's happening inside you, you end up making decisions to soothe emotions, not to build stability. And that, sooner or later, comes with a price. Maybe you think this is just a phase and it'll pass on its own, that when you make more, your mind will calm down. But the truth is, if you don't learn now how to handle this moment, more money will only turn up the volume of the noise inside. The fear of losing grows with the balance. Anxiety adapts, and the silence stays just heavier, because now the consequences feel bigger. That's why so many people make more and still feel trapped. Not because they lack money, but because they lack mental clarity about its role in their life. This is the point where you need to stop and watch what's really happening. Not on the bank statement, but inside your head. Money started coming in, but your mind is still operating like you're in survival mode. Like any mistake is fatal. Like you're still at the edge. And until you change that, no income will bring peace. No raise will feel like enough. No win will be truly celebrated, because everything becomes something to defend over, something to use wisely. And here's something almost nobody talks about, but it changes everything once you understand it. There's a specific moment when money stops being just a number and becomes an emotional shock absorber. A point where it's not there to spend, but to think better, to decide with less urgency, to make fewer desperation mistakes. But before you get there, the road is uncomfortable, confusing, full of mental traps. And if you don't know how to identify them, you'll think the problem is you. In reality, it's the process. You're not wrong for feeling this way. You're not weak for feeling fear now that things are improving. This is more common than it looks. The difference between people who move forward and people who freeze isn't how much money they have, but how they interpret this moment. Some turn this phase into a foundation. If you're here listening to this, it's because something clicked. Because in some way, you saw yourself in this situation. And that's not by accident. There's a next step after this silence. A step that doesn't involve making more, working more, or sacrificing more. It involves understanding what this money needs to do for you right now and not the other way around. But before you get there, you need to recognize where you're standing. And this phase, as uncomfortable as it is a turning point. After that initial silence, there's an even more dangerous phase one. Almost nobody recognizes as a problem. You start thinking you have to be strong all the time. Strong enough not to mess up, strong enough not to spend, strong enough not to slide backward, strong enough not to ask for help. It's like now, finally, you have something to prove. Not to other people, but to yourself. You start repeating in your head that you can't fail, you can't slip, you can't relax. And that pressure doesn't come from outside. It's born inside your mind, fed by the memory of everything you went through when you had nothing. The past starts haunting you in silence. You remember the late bills, the tight months, the sleepless nights, the bad decisions made because you had no choice. And even if things are a little better today, your body still reacts like it could all come back at any moment. It's like someone who almost drowned and now steps into a shallow pool but still can't breathe, right? The danger isn't the same, but fear is still in charge. And when fear is in charge, you don't make good decisions. You just react. That's when you start confusing control with safety. You think watching every expense will protect you. You think thinking about money all day will prevent problems. You think staying tense is a sign of responsibility. But in practice, it just keeps you tired. Mentally tired. You don't notice right away because it isn't physical fatigue. It's that constant weight in your head, that feeling you can never fully turn off. You're always on, always calculating, always worried, and it drains you in a quiet way. Over time, that tension starts showing up in small behaviors. You get more irritated, more impatient. Small things bother you more than they should. You lose the pleasure in simple things because everything gets filtered through money. An invite turns into math. A simple choice turns into a dilemma. Even resting feels wrong, like you're wasting time or money. And the cruelest part is that from the outside, someone might say you're doing better in life. But inside, you feel trapped. And then comes a very common mistake. You start thinking the problem is that you're still down to make enough. That if you made more, all of this would end. That this anxiety is just not having enough money yet. But that's a dangerous half-truth because most of the time, It's not the amount causing the problem, it's the lack of a clear foundation. You started earning, but you didn't build solid ground for your mind to stand on. Without that ground, any amount feels unstable. Any expense feels like a threat. Any surprise feels like a catastrophe. In this scenario, your mind is still operating in emergency mode. Everything is urgent. Everything feels decisive. There's no room for mistakes or learning. Just survival and surviving is exhausting. More exhausting than working hard. Because you can stop working. You can't stop surviving. Your mind doesn't shut off. And while you're stuck in that mode, you don't build anything solid. You just try not to lose. This is where a lot of people start sabotaging themselves without realizing it. Not in an obvious way, but subtly. Some start spending to relieve pressure, like money is emotional anesthesia. Others do the opposite. They freeze completely. Stop investing in themselves. Stop taking opportunities. Stop living. In both cases, the decision doesn't come from clarity, it comes from fear. And decisions made out of fear rarely build anything that lasts. Maybe you've lived one of those two situations, or even both, at different times. One month you feel confident and spend more than you should. The next month, you feel guilty and cut everything. You swing from one extreme to the other, trying to find balance, but never understanding why you never feel truly calm. And that emotional roller coaster has nothing to do with discipline. It has to do with a lack of mental structure, a lack of a point where you can say, below this line, I'm safe. Above this line, I can plan. Without realizing it, you start treating every dollar like it's your last chance. Like every dollar has to do 1,000 jobs at once. Protect you, validate you, give you pleasure, guarantee your future, and no amount of money can carry that weight. That's why it always feels insufficient. No matter how much comes in, something always feels missing. Peace, clarity, that simple feeling that you can breathe without guilt. And this is where most people misdiagnose it. They think they need more control, more spreadsheets, more effort, when what they really need is less emotion in basic decisions. They need to stop deciding everything like they're about to lose everything. They need to create a breathing zone, even a small one, where money isn't an emotional trigger, it's a neutral tool. But until that happens, you stay quiet, carrying it all alone, thinking this weight is normal. And let me tell you something important. It's not that constant state of alert isn't a sign of financial maturity. It's a sign of unresolved financial trauma. It's your body trying to protect you from something that already happened, even when your situation starts to change. And ignoring it just drags the problem out for years. People spend decades making more money, but living like they're still at the edge, because they never stop to reorganize their emotional relationship with money. There's a point still invisible to most people where money stops being the center of your decisions and becomes the support for them. A point where you don't see every expense as a threat, but as a conscious choice. A point where you don't have to go silent out of fear, because you know exactly where you stand. But reaching that point isn't automatic. It doesn't happen just because your income went up. It happens when you build a minimum foundation of safety that doesn't depend on the mood of the month or your willpower. After living in that tense silence for a while, something curious happens. You start thinking that state is the new normal, that living worried is a sign of responsibility, that being always alert is maturity. You look back and think it used to be worse, so you conclude you don't have the right to feel bad now. And that's exactly where the trap closes. Because when you normalize anxiety, you stop looking for clarity. You accept living tired on the inside, like that's the unavoidable price of improving your life. But that constant tension starts charging invisible interest. You lose focus, lose creativity, lose courage. Everything becomes maintenance. Maintain what came in. Maintain the lifestyle. Maintain the appearance that everything is under control. And when life becomes only maintenance, it becomes heavy. There's no feeling of progressively fear of going backward. You don't feel like you're building something, just defending territory. And defending is far more exhausting than building. At that point, many people start quietly wondering if it was worth it. They don't say it out loud because it sounds absurd. After all, money came in, things should be better now. But inside, that uncomfortable doubt shows up. Is this what I was chasing? And that question hurts because it feels ungrateful. It feels weak. It feels like something is wrong with you, but there isn't. What's wrong is the expectation that money alone would solve a problem that was always emotional and psychological. You didn't just want to pay bills. You wanted peace. You wanted to sleep without that pressure in your chest. You wanted to stop thinking about money all the time. You wanted to feel that if something went wrong, it wouldn't be the end of the world. And when that doesn't happen, even with more money coming, in frustration hits, but you swallow it, you stay quiet, you keep going. Because stopping to look at it is scary. It's scary to realize you're too exhausted to celebrate anything. And it's exactly here that another silent mistake shows up. You start thinking you have to earn peace, like rest is a reward, like relief can only come after even more sacrifice. So you push yourself harder, work more, endure more, push the limit a little further, all in the name of a future that never arrives because when it gets close, you push it again. There's always something missing, always a little more money needed to feel safe, always a little more effort required to allow yourself to relax. Without realizing it, you build an unfair relationship with your own money. It's never enough to give you peace, but it's always enough to demand more responsibility from you. It's never and only a source of worry. And that's how, even while improving your life, you still feel indebted to the future. Like you're always behind, like you're always chasing something you never catch. Now pay attention to this because it's a key point. The problem isn't that you're not there yet. The problem is that you never defined where there is. Without a clear point of safety, your mind never turns off alert mode. It doesn't know when it can relax. It doesn't know when danger has passed. So it treats everything as a threat. A simple expense becomes risk. A surprise becomes panic. A decision becomes weight. And that's not a lack of money. That's a lack of reference. Until you set a minimum that lets you breathe, every dollar that comes in becomes only more responsibility. More to protect, more to lose. And that's why the silence continues. Because talking about it feels too complicated, like nobody will understand. Like you should be happy, not confused. But confusion is exactly the sign that something needs adjusting. There's a moment when you need to stop asking, how do I make more? And start asking, what does this money need to do for me right now? Not in some distant future, right now. What is its function at this stage of your life? Because money without a clear function becomes anxiety. Money without a defined purpose becomes mental noise. And until that changes, you stay a hostage to your own emotions. And here begins a quiet but powerful shift. When you understand that money's first job isn't to multiply or to show off or to impress anyone, it's to reduce the stress in your mind, to create an emotional cushion, a space where mistakes don't become tragedy, where surprises don't become desperation, where decisions can be made calmly. That's the point where everything truly starts to change. But pay attention. It doesn't happen all at once. It isn't magic. It's a process of leaving survival mode and entering strategy mode. And that transition is uncomfortable because you have to let go of excessive control. You have to accept that not everything needs to be watched all the time. You have to trust structure's not just your mental strength. And that scares anyone who spent a long time at the edge. In the next part, I'm going to show you how this change begins to happen in practice. How to get out of this heavy silence without losing what you've built. How to turn this early money into something that gives you clarity, not fear. And how to stop living with the feeling that everything could end tomorrow. So stay with me, because now the conversation is going to get practical without losing the emotional weight that's really in charge of the decisions. At this only point, without even realizing it, you start feeling a different kind of fatigue. It's not a lack of physical energy. It's decision fatigue. Thinking fatigue, the fatigue of having to be right all the time. Every choice feels like it has a hidden risk. Every simple decision becomes something you replay in your head multiple times afterward. You decide today, and tomorrow, you're already wondering if you did the right thing. And it keeps stacking up. A quiet, daily wear and tear that doesn't show anywhere, but consumes you on the inside. That's the direct effect of living without a defined ground. When you don't know exactly where your safety line is, everything feels like it's on the table all the time. You don't know how far you can go. You don't know what you can risk. You don't know what you can spend without guilt. So you treat everything like it's dangerous. And when everything is dangerous, your mind never rests. That's when many people start confusing prudence with paralysis. They think they're being responsible when they're really just afraid. Afraid of taking a wrong step. Afraid of messing up now that things started working. Afraid of disappointing themselves. And that fear starts shaping behavior. You begin delaying important decisions. You keep pushing plans forward. You start living in a constant waiting mode, like you're always getting ready for something that never comes. You tell yourself it's not the right time yet, that you need more money, more stability, more certainty. But the problem is that this more never ends, because it isn't a number, it's a feeling. And while you don't solve the feeling, no amount will feel like enough. You can double your income and still feel like it's not enough to relax, because the standard was never clear. At that point, life starts getting smaller. You avoid committing. You avoid dreaming big. You avoid changing, all to avoid shaking up the fragile structure you built. And without realizing it, you trade growth for false safety. A safety that doesn't give you peace, it just keeps you from moving forward. You stay functional, but stuck. Organized, but tense. Better than before, but far from feeling good. And this creates a cruel paradox. The more you try to protect yourself, the more vulnerable you feel, because that protection isn't coming from something solid, but from your constant effort. And effort gets exhausting. If you stop, everything feels like it will fall apart. So you don't stop, you don't relax, you don't allow mistakes, you don't allow yourself to learn calmly. You live on alert, like you're always one step away from failure. Now pay very close attention to this, because here's one of the most important turning points of the entire story. Money shouldn't depend on your attention all the time to work. If it only holds together when you're tense, something is wrong, because that means your financial life is being supported by your anxiety, not by a structure. And anxiety isn't a foundation for anything that lasts. There's a huge difference between taking care of money and policing money. Taking care brings peace. Policing brings paranoia. Taking care lets you breathe. Policing keeps you trapped. And most people who start making money without an emotional foundation end up in constant policing. Not because they want to, but because they don't know any other way. That's when a quiet question shows up, when many people avoid even putting into words. But it changes everything when it appears. What needs to happen for me to feel minimally safe? Not rich, not free of problems, just safe enough to think clearly. Safe enough not to panic over every surprise. Safe enough not to make impulsive decisions. That question is uncomfortable because it forces honesty. It forces you to stop chasing random numbers and start defining real limits. And most people avoid it because defining limits means taking responsibility. It means saying, this is what I need to breathe. From here, I can plan. Without that, everything becomes a confusing pile of money with no function. When you don't define that minimum, all the money gets mixed together. What's for emergencies, what's for living, what's for the future, it all becomes one thing. And when everything is one thing, any expense feels like an attack on your future. Any surprise feels like an existential threat. And then fear takes over again. The change starts when you understand that money's first job isn't growth, it's to pull you out of panic mode. To create distance between you and desperation, a space where you can make small mistakes without turning it into a big crisis. That space isn't a luxury. It's a psychological need. Without it, you can still move forward, but it will always hurt. And no, that doesn't mean saving money just to save it. It means naming it, giving it a clear function, something your mind can recognize as this protects me. When money has a function, it calms you down. When it doesn't, it only increases anxiety, because the human brain doesn't handle abstractions well. It needs concrete references to turn off the alarm. In the next chapters, I'm going to show you how this foundation starts getting built upon if you don't make much. How to stop depending on willpower, how to move from obsessive control into a simple, almost automatic system, and how that changes not only your finances, but how you sleep, decide, and live. At some point, almost without noticing, you start testing small limits. Not because you feel confident, but because you're exhausted from being stuck. You make a slightly different purchase. You accept a commitment you would have avoided before. You make a decision without calculating so much. And the interesting part is that when nothing collapses, you feel a strange relief. Not happiness, relief, like your body is saying, okay, maybe it's not that fragile. That moment is small, but powerful, because it reveals something fear was hiding. Not every mistake becomes tragedy. Not every expense becomes ruin. Not every decision has to be perfect to work. But because it isn't organized in your head yet, that relief doesn't last long. Soon, fear comes back. Guilt shows up. You wonder if you were irresponsible, if you overdid it, if you let yourself get carried away and you swing again between moving forward a little and mentally punishing yourself right after. That happens because you still haven't created a clear line between what's dangerous and what's just uncomfortable. Without that line, everything feels equally threatening. And here's a point that completely changes the game once you understand it. Most people don't need more money to get out of survival mode. They need predictability. They need to know there's a line below which life doesn't collapse. While that line isn't clear, the brain assumes the worst scenario every time. It doesn't operate on hope. It operates on protection. And protection without reference becomes panic. You spent so long dealing with surprises like emergencies that your body learned to react before thinking unexpected bill. Instant tension, unplanned expense, automatic guilt, income fluctuation, immediate fear. That isn't lack of control, it's conditioning. And it isn't solved with willpower. It's solved with structure. Without structure, you become dependent on your mood, your energy, your constant attention. On good days, you feel capable. On bad days, everything feels like a mistake. And because life isn't linear, you live on an emotional roller coaster. 1 month confident, another month frozen, one day hopeful. The next, desperate, and money becomes the thermometer of your emotional state when it should be the opposite. What starts changing everything is when you stop treating money like one single block and start separating functions. Not just mentally, but concretely. When you understand that one portion isn't meant to grow or be touched or bring you pleasure, it exists only to calm you down, to be the point where your mind finally understands that if something goes out of control, you don't go straight back to chaos. That money doesn't have to be big. It has to be reliable. It has to be out of reach of impulsive decisions. It has to be boring. No glamour. No emotion. Exactly, because its job isn't to excite you, it's to stabilize you. And when that foundation starts to exist, something changes inside. The noise gets quieter, decisions get less dramatic, mistakes get smaller, and for the first time, you start feeling like you don't have to police everything all the time. That creates a chain reaction. You start sleeping better, thinking more calmly, saying no more often without guilt, saying yes with more awareness, because now there's a cushion between you and disaster. Before, any slip felt like free fall. Now, it's just a bump, and your body feels that difference before your mind even understands it. At that point, silence starts changing meaning. It stops being feared and becomes clarity. You don't talk about money because you don't need to prove anything to anyone, not because you're afraid of losing it. You compare yourself less, not because you feel inferior, but because you're busy building something solid. Money stops being a topic loaded with emotion and becomes a neutral part of your life. Important, but not dominant. But pay attention. This process isn't automatic or comfortable at first. In the beginning, you'll catch yourself wanting to use that foundation to relieve momentary anxiety. You'll feel tempted to dip into it. You'll question whether it couldn't be earning more, growing more, doing something more smart. And that's exactly where a lot of people break their own safety. Because they confuse anxiety with opportunity. They confuse restlessness with necessary action. Keeping that foundation intact, especially in the beginning, requires a deep mindset shift. It requires accepting that not all money has to be working. Some money just needs to sit still, doing the invisible job of giving you peace. And that invisible job is what allows everything else to work better later. Once that foundation exists, the money that comes in starts having a different effect. It no longer lands on unstable ground. It's supported by something firm. And that completely changes how you plan, risk, and grow. You start thinking in the medium term. You start seeing choices. You move from reaction to strategy. In the next chapters, I'm going to go deeper into exactly that. How this foundation changes your relationship with opportunities, how it prevents small problems from turning into big crises, and how it creates a kind of mental freedom that many people think only comes with a lot of money, but actually starts much earlier. When that minimum foundation starts to exist, something curious happens. Problems don't disappear, but the way you react to them changes completely. Before any surprise felt like a sign everything was falling apart, now it becomes just another annoying event. Still frustrating, still unwanted, but not perfect. You feel the difference in your body. Your heart doesn't race the same way. Your mind doesn't jump to worst case scenarios immediately. There's space between the problem and your reaction. And that space is everything. That space is where clarity starts to grow. You start realizing that many bad decisions in the past weren't stupidity or irresponsibility. They were pressure decisions. Decisions made from fear of running out. Decisions made with too much urgency. And when you leave that state, you naturally make fewer mistakes. Not because you got smarter, but because you're not desperate anymore. That even changes how you see your own effort. Before, it felt like you worked hard and never moved. Now you start feeling like your work pays off more. Not because you suddenly started making more money, but because you stopped wasting mental energy on constant worry. You can focus better, plan better, say no to what doesn't make sense, and overachieve. That makes a huge difference. Another quiet effect of that foundation is that you stop living while expecting the worst. Before, any good stretch came with a strange feeling like it was too temporary, like something bad was right there, about to happen. You didn't enjoy it because you were always preparing for the fall. Now, even knowing problems will still happen. You don't live anticipating disaster. You deal with it when it shows up, not before. That frees up mental space you didn't even know you were spending. And that's where many people get surprised because they realize they didn't need that much money to start feeling better. They needed emotional organization. They needed a clear place to rest their mind. They needed to stop treating every dollar like life or death. And when that happens, their relationship with money changes tone. Money stops being a judge and becomes a tool. But this new state also brings a different challenge. Now that you're not panicking, the temptation to speed everything up shows up. To make up for lost time. To want to do in 1 year what you didn't do in 5. And here lives another quiet danger. Urgency. Urgency no longer comes from fear of lacking, but from the desire to arrive faster. And if you don't notice it, you can trade one problem for another. It's important to understand that leaving survival mode doesn't mean entering euphoria mode. It means entering consistency mode, a much less exciting mode, but far more effective, where you move slowly without hurting yourself, where progress doesn't depend on spikes, but on repetition. And for someone who lived on the edge for a long time, that can even feel strange. It feels slow, it feels like not enough, but it's exactly what works long term. At this point, you start noticing something interesting in the people around you. Some are always agitated, always rushing, always complaining that money comes in and goes out too fast. Others are calmer, even making about the same. The difference isn't the amount, it's the structure. Some live putting out fires, others live preventing fires. And little by little, you start moving into the second group. You also feel less shame about your story because you realize it makes sense. That each phase had a reason. That you went behind you or learning under pressure. And that takes a huge weight off your shoulders. You compare yourself less. You stop thinking everyone is ahead of you. You stop using money as a measure of your worth. And that's freeing in a way people rarely talk about. Your financial life becomes less dramatic and more predictable. Not perfect, not problem-free, but predictable. And predictability is what allows planning. It's what allows you to think about the future without anxiety. It's what allows decisions that aren't just reactions to the present. You start seeing paths, not only obstacles. And at this stage, something very important happens. You realize that talking less about money isn't defense anymore. It's a choice. You don't need to explain, justify, or prove anything. You know where you are, you know where you're going, and that brings a quiet confidence that doesn't draw attention, but holds everything up. In the next chapters, we're going to go even further. I'm going to show you how this clarity changes how you deal with opportunities, mistakes, and the future. How to avoid common traps after things start improving, and how to keep this foundation firm even when income fluctuates. When that predictability starts to exist, you feel something new. A false sense of mastery, not arrogance, but that quiet thought of, I get it now. And that's dangerous, not because you're wrong, but because the human mind loves turning relief into overconfidence. You escaped chaos, so everything feels easy in comparison. Money doesn't scare you like it used to. Decisions feel simple. And that's exactly when many people start letting their guard down, not consciously, subtly. You begin loosening things that used to be clear. You make small exceptions. Then more, you start mixing what was foundation with what was choice. Nothing blows up right away. Actually, it feels like everything is under control. That's what tricks you, because the problem in this phase isn't the big mistake, it's the slow erosion of structure. You think, just this once. I'll adjust later. Now I can. And maybe you can. The problem isn't spending, risking, or deciding. The problem is when you lose the reference that pulled you out of survival mode. When that foundation that gave you peace starts turning into generic money again without a clear job. When that happens, the brain doesn't warn you right away. It just slowly starts returning to alert mode. You start feeling light anxiety with no clear reason, a vague discomfort, a feeling that something is off, but you can't tell what. And because you're no longer in chaos, that anxiety is confusing. You think it's boredom, that you need a bigger challenge, that you want to grow faster, and you try to fix it by accelerating, doing more, risking more, when in reality, what's missing is emotional stability being respected. This is something almost nobody talks about. Financial progress isn't a straight line. It's a constant dance between advancing and preserving. Whoever only advances eventually trips. Whoever only preserves eventually stagnates. Balance doesn't come from willpower. It comes from clarity about what each part of the money is for. When that clarity disappears, the system starts failing. You start seeing it in your behavior. You go back to overthinking before spending. You go back to replaying old decisions. You go back to that slight tightness in your chest when something goes off plan. It's not as intense as before, but it's familiar, and your body recognizes it. It remembers. And when the body remembers, the mind goes back on alert. Something important happens here. You realize it's not enough to build a foundation. You have to protect it from yourself, from your phases, your mood, your expectations, because the biggest risk to your financial life isn't external surprises. It's internal decisions made when you're anxious, bored, or overly confident. And that completely changes how you see yourself. You stop thinking you're weak for needing limits. You understand limits aren't a prison, they're protection, that it isn't a lack of ambition to separate what gives you peace from what gives you growth. It's emotional intelligence. It's maturity. It's knowing that without a clear mind, no money holds up. At this stage, you start accepting something that used to feel strange. Not every dollar you make needs to be optimized. Some of it needs to be ignored, forgotten, kept out of your emotional radar. Because the more you look at it, the more you interfere. And too much interference creates instability. The money that gives you peace needs to stay far from your impulsiveness, your curiosity, your need to speed up. And that brings a curious feeling, a mix of calm and humility. You realize you don't control everything, and you don't have to. The goal isn't to never mess up, it's to mess up small, to mess up without destroying yourself, to mess up without going back to rock bottom. And that changes everything. Life starts feeling less heavy, not because it became perfect, but because you stop carrying everything on your shoulders. Some things are handled. Not forever, but enough. And that frees up space to live, to think about other areas, to breathe, to feel like money is finally doing the right job. In the next chapters, I'm going to show you how to keep this foundation even when income changes, when tempting opportunities show up, and when life tests you again. Because it tests you, it always does. The difference is how you respond when it happens. When you understand you need to protect the foundation even from yourself, something changes in how you see time. Before, everything was urgent. Now, patience starts to exist. Not the pretty quote style patience, but practical, almost cold patience. You stop expecting immediate results. You stop thinking every month has to be better than the last. You start accepting that stability isn't exciting, but it's powerful. And that's a shock to anyone who spent a long time living through highs and lows. In that moment, you start noticing how external noise influences you more than it should. Conversations, comparisons, stories of overnight success, people saying you're moving too slow. Before, that would hit hard. Now, it still annoys you, but it doesn't control you because you know exactly what you keep protecting. the emotional cost of losing that foundation. And, no shortcut is worth going back to that constant alert mode. You start looking at old decisions with more compassion. You stop insulting yourself in your head. You stop thinking, if I had done it differently. You realized you did what you could with the mindset you had at the time. And that understanding doesn't make you complacent. It makes you clearer. Because now you decide without carrying guilt. And guilt always distorts choices. Little by little, money stops being the center of your identity. It's there important, organized, with a clear job, but it no longer defines who you are. You don't measure yourself by your balance. You compare less. You don't feel that need to prove anything. And that even changes how you talk. You speak less about money, not because you're afraid, but because you don't need it as validation anymore. And then something happens that many people only notice much later. When money leaves the emotional center of your life, it starts working better. You make fewer mistakes, not because you became perfect, but because you're not reacting. You plan better, not because you became an expert, but because you're not under pressure. You grow more, not because you sped up, but because you stopped sabotaging yourself. But life doesn't let anyone coast for long. A test always shows up. A dip in income, an unexpected expense, an opportunity that looks too good. And that's where this new structure gets tested. The difference is you don't panic. You feel discomfort, sure, but it doesn't take over. You analyze, you wait, you decide with your head, not your stomach. When something goes off plan, you no longer think everything is ruined. You think, okay, this is part of it. And that shift is huge because it stops a small problem from becoming a big crisis. It stops one mistake from becoming a chain of mistakes. It stops you from throwing away months of progress because of one bad week. At this stage, you start trusting processes more than impulses. Simple systems, repeated, almost automatic. You understand you can't depend on motivation every day or discipline or mood because that changes. What can't change is the foundation. The basics have to happen even on bad days, especially on bad days. And that consistency creates something rare. Sustainable.com. Not the kind of excitement that fades fast, but a calm that can take a hit that doesn't disappear with the first surprise. That doesn't depend on a good month to exist. You start living knowing you're not immune to problems, but you're prepared for them. And that completely changes how you see the future. The future stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like possible territory. You don't know exactly how it'll look, but you know you won't be completely lost. And that simple certainty, almost boring, is something a lot of people spend their whole lives without ever feeling because they never built this foundation. They never truly left survival mode. And then you understand clearly what that early silence meant. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't fear for no reason. It was your instinct trying to protect you while you still didn't have structure. Now, the silence is different. It's calm. It's steady. It doesn't weigh you down. It holds you up. You don't need to run anymore. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to punish yourself. You know where you are. You know what you're doing. And you know that even if life changes, you don't fall back into chaos because now there's solid ground. There comes a moment when you realize something simple but deep. Money stopped being the main topic in your head. It still matters. Of course, it still needs attention, but it no longer takes up the emotional space it used to. You don't wake up thinking about it. You don't fall asleep replaying decisions. You don't spend the whole day calculating scenarios. It became background, and when something stops being center stage, life starts to feel deeper. You start noticing that decisions got quieter, not in the sense of hiding, but in the sense of not needing drama. You decide, you execute, and you move on without needing to check over and over if you did it right, without that anxious need for future approval. You trust the process more because it has proven itself to you many times. Achi somi point. You begin to understand something that once felt distant. Freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's not being held hostage by fear. It's being able to say no without guilt, to wait without desperation, to choose without feeling like one mistake will cost you everything. And that freedom didn't come from one giant leap. It came from a series of small, repeated, almost boring decisions made with clarity. You look back and realize the biggest gain wasn't financial, it was mental. You gained space in your mind, You gained calm. You gained the ability to think without urgency. And that changes everything. Because now, when an opportunity appears, you don't act from scarcity. When a problem shows up, you don't react in panic. You evaluate. And that alone puts you in a completely different place from most people. You also start accepting that your financial life will never be perfect. There will always be some uncertainty, some level of risk. But now it doesn't paralyze you. You don't try to eliminate risk, you learn to live with it. And that acceptance brings a strange kind of peace, almost uncomfortable at first, because you spent so long trying to control everything. Now you realize that controlling less with more structure works better. The silence that once felt heavy becomes comfortable. You don't need to announce your wins. You don't need to justify your choices. You don't need to explain your pace, because you know exactly why you're doing what you're doing. And that internal security is far stronger than any external validation. It doesn't depend on applause. It doesn't depend on comparison. It stands on its own. Then something happens that many people only notice too late. You start living better now, not just someday in the future. Before, everything was sacrificed for an abstract later. Now, the present matters too. You don't feel guilty for small pleasures. You don't punish yourself for resting. You don't obsess over every dollar, because you know the foundation is there, quietly doing its job. You realize money wasn't meant to watch you or judge you. It was meant to serve you. And when it does, life feels lighter. Not easy, not perfect, but honest, possible, breathable. You no longer feel that constant injustice of, I do everything right and still don't move forward, because now you can see the movement slow sometimes, but real. If someone asked you what changed, you might not even know how to explain it. You wouldn't talk about numbers. You'd talk about how it feels. Sleeping better. Deciding with more calm. Not feeling that tightness in your chest all the time. Not being afraid to look at your finances anymore. Because now looking doesn't hurt. Looking organizes. That's what most people don't understand. The goal was never just to save money. It was never about reaching a magic number. The goal was always to move out of survival mode and into life mode, where problems still exist, but don't crush you, where the future feels less frightening, where money stops being an emotional weight and becomes a quiet tool working in your favor. If you pay attention, you'll see none of this was about getting rich fast or making some miraculous jump. It was about leaving a mental state that kept you tense, tired, and afraid of losing everything. The money started small, confusing, and quiet. It brought anxiety before relief. It made you silent before it made you smile. And that wasn't a mistake. It was a sign. The silence at the beginning wasn't weakness. It was instinct. Your mind trying to protect something that wasn't stable yet. The problem was never earning money. It was not knowing how to handle it emotionally when it started to appear. It was living as if one mistake could send you back to zero, treating every decision like your last chance. Along the way, you realized something that changes everything. Money isn't first for spending, investing, or showing results. It's for getting you out of survival mode, for building a floor, a level below which your life doesn't collapse. When that floor exists, your mind changes. Your decisions change. Your life changes. You stop watching every dollar in desperation. You stop punishing yourself for small mistakes. You stop living in constant alert. You build a simple, boring, unglamorous foundation, but powerful. A foundation that impresses no one, yet holds you together inside. That's when the real transformation begins. Money stops being a judge and becomes a quiet employee, working in the background to give you calm, clarity, and time. Time to think, to choose, to make mistakes without destroying yourself, to live without that constant weight in your chest. You don't become immune to problems. You become prepared for them. Today, you understand that freedom isn't unlimited spending. It's not making decisions out of fear. It's not being held hostage by anxiety. It's not needing to prove anything to anyone. It's knowing exactly why you do what you do, even when no one is watching. Silence doesn't feel heavy anymore. It protects. It organizes. It supports. If there's one thing you take from this, it's this. The final goal was never the number in your account. It was the mental freedom to treat financial problems as logistics, not tragedies. When you reach that point, life isn't perfect, but it becomes possible, breathable, honest. If this video helped you organize your thoughts, if you saw yourself in this quiet journey, leave a like now because it really helps this message reach more people who are going through the same thing. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, because here the conversation is always direct, simple, and real. No fantasy, no empty promises. And if you made it to the end, comment the word silence below. I'll know you stayed until the last second and that this message spoke to you.